I don't want to get caught up in this mess. I'm not here to make a video taking ideological sides in the Virginia controversy, for the same reason that I needn't make a video discussing whether or not the Nazis had a point in World War II or something of the sort. It's pretty obvious to anybody who is willing to dispel their political biases who is at fault here. Instead, I want to talk about the issue that actually sparked the situation, as a point of interest, not as some kind of political pursuit. But just briefly, as a disclaimer, Nazis are scum, or at best victims of indoctrination. White supremacists are too, as are black supremacists, Asian supremacists, or anybody who claims that a person's worth can be judged by the colour of their skin. And President Trump should have been quicker to denounce these people. Now, some more facts. There was violence on both sides, and not everybody taking part in the protests took part in the savagery. But to those defending Nazi violence, the violence of groups like Antifa does not in any way justify driving a car into a crowd of protesters. Likewise, to those defending the violence of Antifa, political violence is always reprehensible, and to recognise that it's the wrong response to a protest is not in any way to legitimise the views of those taking part in the protest. Finally, to concede these points is not in any way to imply an ideological equivalency between either side. Believe me, if I was in Virginia, I know exactly on which side I'd be stood and exactly how loud I'd be shouting. But once the first punch is thrown, you can forget any hopes of progress. Everything that happened in Charlottesville was a disaster. The violence was unequivocally sparked by racism and bigotry, and though there are people on either side of the conflict who should be condemned, it's patently obvious who is to blame. Yes, the torchlit march was legal, and yes, its chants were and are protected by the First Amendment. Yes, it was illegal to respond to this with violence, but just use your head. If you start chanting anti-Semitic and homophobic rhetoric in people's faces, can you really expect anything else by way of response? Forget about what's legal and what's not for a moment, and just think about what's moral and what's immoral. And if, like me, you genuinely wish to see this kind of stuff wiped from the face of the planet, then we have to recognise that violence only ever worsens the problem, even if you think that it's morally deserved. It's all too easy to defend the free speech of people that you agree with. It's more difficult to defend the free speech of those who you disagree with, but to be able to defend the free speech of those whom you detest, not just those you disagree with, those whose words make you shrivel with anger, and then to use your own free speech to dismantle every shred of credibility that these supremacists think that they have, is the most effective way, and perhaps begrudgingly the only way, to retain public support and show these racists who the real Americans are. With that said, let's now take a look at the issue that actually sparked the quagmire, the proposed removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee. If you don't know who Robert E. Lee was, you're not alone. It's worth doing your own research, but essentially Lee was a fantastically talented US general who was on the wrong side of history. As a commander of the Confederate Army of North Virginia, he won many battles, often against much more powerful Union forces, a testament to his military excellency. However, the issue here is the whole Confederate part of his resume. For those who, like me, were never taught US history, after the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860, 7 states attempted to secede from the United States and found a new government. A civil war ensued, with these 7 states forming the Confederate States of America in the South, who fought against the rest of the US for their independence. After the war started, 4 more states joined the Confederacy, including Virginia, where Robert E. Lee was resident. And though Lee favoured a united America, and in fact was offered a post to fight against the Confederacy, his heart ultimately lied with his state, which he couldn't face fighting against, and he joined the rebellion. The reason this is all relevant here is that one of the primary disagreements between the Unionists and the Confederates was the ownership of slaves. Lincoln had been elected on a platform opposed to the expansion of slavery, and with much of the southern economy being dependent upon agriculture and cotton, in turn dependent upon unpaid labour, this wasn't met with overwhelming positivity from the states that eventually formed the Confederacy. So, in somewhat of a simplification, Robert E. Lee, being a commander in the Confederacy, was fighting for the right of his state and 10 others to own other people. Not a good look. So hopefully at the very least you can sympathise with the popular view in Charlottesville that this man should not be immortalised as a statue in a park that's called would you believe it, Emancipation Park, recently renamed from Lee Park earlier this year. With the name change, there's been a strong surge of support for the removal of the statue of Lee, as many understandably feel that he personifies the dehumanization of African Americans. However, not everybody agrees with this, or some even because they agree with this, want the statue to remain. Some of these people in fact decided to protest the removal on the streets of Charlottesville and, well, welcome back to the present. So then, the actual contention. Is it a good idea to remove artifacts of history, such as this statue of Robert Lee, on the grounds that they can instill social negativity and shouldn't be in a position for anyone to revere? Well, on the one hand, many argue that he is a symbol of racism and therefore has no place in the centre of a park in modern society. But on the other, people are countering that it's wrong to try and erase history. Also, Lee isn't the only immortalised historical figure in the US with ties to racism. The point has been raised endlessly over the past few days that people such as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, among others, owned slaves themselves. So should we be removing depictions of them too? President Trump seemed to recognise this line of thought on Tuesday when he said, "This week it is Robert E. Lee, and this week Stonewall Jackson. Is it George Washington next?" You have to ask yourself, where does it stop? Perhaps a fair point. So where do we draw the line? Well, of course everybody will have their own views, but if you want mine, I'm happy to give them to you. If I lived in Charlottesville, I can promise you that I would deplore living next to a statue of a man who fought for slavery. I'd absolutely want it gone. Not completely, as there is definitely a need to remember the past, and I understand the historical significance, but it should probably just be moved to a museum, as many have suggested. However, I wouldn't feel the same about Jefferson or Washington. This is my line. To me, it's about what these people actively fought for. In the late 18th century, slavery was an absolute norm, and it constituted nothing more than the context to the work of the Founding Fathers. Of course, slavery was still wrong by today's standards, but it's easier to forgive the founders, who were actually largely against slavery, often writing in favour of its abolishment, than a man who literally fought for its preservation. The way I see it is that someone like Jefferson would probably have liked to have seen slavery abolished, and though he did own slaves, would probably have easily given them up if the country decided to outlaw it. Lee, on the other hand, literally helped to try to create a new state in order to preserve it. What are these men symbols of? When someone says Thomas Jefferson, what springs to mind? Author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, composer of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, provider for the Library of Congress after the burning of Washington, you name it. He also happened to live in a time when many people, including himself, utilised unpaid labour. Okay, what about Robert Lee? Well, his crowning achievement was fighting for the Confederacy. Here's the point. Because fighting for the Confederacy was the only really notable achievement, if you can call it that, of Robert E. Lee, the only reason you could possibly support him is if you support the Confederacy. Whereas because Jefferson did many great things, support for him can be for a wide variety of much more agreeable reasons. And this is what it really comes down to: intent. If you want to idolise Robert E. Lee, it's probably because you support his ideals and are pro-Confederacy, whatever. If you want to idolise Jefferson, your motives are likely much more benign. That is to say, any person, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, take your pick, had their faults. Any person we paint or sculpt will have some terrible characteristics within them somewhere or other. But the reason that this doesn't matter is because we don't erect statues to venerate people, but to venerate the causes that they represent. And whilst Jefferson was one of the key figures in originally uniting America, Robert Lee was a key figure in trying to tear it apart. And not for some valiant cause either, but so that his state could keep their slaves. That's the difference. Now, you might disagree and call me a hypocrite and think that we should pull down all statues of Jefferson. Or you may disagree with me that the statue should be moved at all. Maybe you agree with Trump. Where do we draw the line? But whatever you think, it's clear that emotions are running high. I'm absolutely willing to listen to anybody who disagrees with my admiration for the Founding Fathers or my distaste for Confederate statues. But that's exactly what we have to do. Listen to each other. It wouldn't take a Nazi march of white supremacists waving swastikas in my face to convince me to change my mind about the removal of a statue of Robert Lee. In fact, such protests only make me want it to go even more. All it would take to make me change my mind is a good argument. So, to those who filled the streets of Charlottesville, desperate to keep your statue, let me know when you've got one. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. You can find me on social media here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.